Imagine waking up one morning in the middle of a vast, barren desert. The sun already blazes in the sky, burning the sand beneath your feet. You and your family are starving, unsure if you'll even survive another day. The children cry out for food, but there's none to be found. You've left behind the relative comforts of Egypt, where at least there was bread to eat. And now, nothing. Desperation clutches at your throat, but then something unusual catches your eye. As you step outside your tent, you see something entirely unexpected. Tiny, mysterious flakes covering the ground like dew. It sparkles in the morning light, unlike anything you've ever seen. Your mind races with questions. "What is this?" you ask aloud, your voice filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. The others gather around, staring at the strange substance on the ground, but no one has an answer. This wasn't just any morning in history. This was the reality for the Israelites, wandering the wilderness after their miraculous escape from slavery in Egypt. They had seen God part the Red Sea and defeat their enemies, yet now in the middle of this unforgiving desert, they faced a new kind of trial. And the mysterious flakes they found? They called it manna, which in Hebrew literally means, "What is it?" It's a name that has echoed through time, captivating the hearts and minds of believers for generations. Was this bread? Was this a miracle? But as the Israelites soon discovered, manna wasn't just a strange desert food. It was a message from heaven. Every morning this mysterious bread appeared, a daily reminder that they were not forgotten, that God was with them in the harshest of conditions. And yet, even today, thousands of years later, manna still raises profound questions. Why did God choose to feed his people in this miraculous way? Was it simply to fill their stomachs? Or was there a far deeper meaning behind this daily provision from heaven? In this video, we're going to dive deep into the story of manna, the bread from heaven that sustained the Israelites for 40 long years. We'll uncover the deeper spiritual lessons hidden within it, lessons of faith, trust, and complete dependence on God. But that's not all. Stay with us until the end, because we'll also explore the latest archaeological findings that might just reveal what manna actually was. Could modern science finally explain this ancient miracle? Or does manna still hold secrets that remain beyond our understanding, even today? Together, we will journey through the wilderness with the Israelites, as they learned to rely on God's miraculous provision every single day. Their struggle for survival wasn't just physical. It was a test of faith. The lessons they learned in that desert about dependence on God are lessons that we too can apply to our own lives today. Whether we're facing spiritual drought, personal hardship, or moments of doubt, the story of manna invites us to trust in a higher power that provides for us even when all seems lost. By the end of this journey, you'll discover that manna is more than just a historical footnote. It's a powerful symbol of how we can navigate our own deserts of life, relying on God's daily grace to sustain us. So buckle up as we embark on this incredible exploration, revealing not only the history behind manna, but the timeless spiritual truths it carries. The exodus from Egypt was nothing short of miraculous. The Israelites, once bound by the chains of slavery, were now free, having witnessed the parting of the Red Sea, a moment forever etched into their collective memory. But as their feet touched the dry, unforgiving sands of the wilderness, they quickly realized that their journey was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Their destination? The Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place where they would no longer be oppressed, but instead could thrive and live in peace. Yet between them and their new home lay a vast, hostile desert. The journey that should have taken mere weeks stretched into 40 long years. But why? What was the purpose of such an extended stay in this desolate land? At first, the Israelites were full of hope, their faith freshly strengthened by God's miracles in Egypt. But hope is hard to maintain when you're surrounded by nothing but endless dunes, blistering heat, and a sky that offers no rain. The desert, in all its stark beauty, was a place of isolation and despair. Food and water were scarce, and the excitement of freedom soon gave way to the gnawing fear of starvation. Hunger does strange things to people. It weakens the body, clouds the mind, and can even make people long for what they once despised. The Israelites, who had once celebrated their escape from Egypt, now found themselves yearning for the food they had left behind. In their desperation, some even spoke longingly of their days of slavery, saying, "At least in Egypt we had food. We had meat to eat. Why did you bring us here to die?" Their cries reached Moses, the leader who had been tasked with guiding them to freedom. But Moses too was human. Faced with an entire nation on the brink of despair, he did what any leader would do: he turned to God. And in that moment, God responded, not with rebuke or anger, but with provision. He promised to send manna, a mysterious food from heaven, to sustain his people. Yet, this wasn't just about satisfying physical hunger. God was teaching the Israelites a deeper lesson. A lesson about trust, faith, and dependence. The desert wasn't simply a geographical space. It was a spiritual proving ground, a place where God would mold his people, teaching them to rely on him for their every need. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses would later reflect on this time, saying, "He humbled you, causing you to hunger and then feeding you with manna, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." The desert became a test of faith and endurance. With no fertile soil to farm, no rivers to fish from, the Israelites were forced to confront their deepest fears. Would they trust God even when the situation seemed hopeless? Or would they, as they had in moments of weakness, look back to Egypt, longing for what was behind them instead of trusting in the promise ahead? God's provision of manna was a daily reminder that he had not abandoned them, that he was with them in the wilderness. But it wasn't without its own set of rules. Each morning, the Israelites would find manna scattered on the ground like dew. They were instructed to gather only what they needed for that day, no more, no less. Any attempt to hoard it resulted in spoilage, a clear message that they had to trust in God's provision day by day. This daily gathering became an act of faith. Every morning, they had to believe that the manna would be there, that God's promise would be fulfilled again. And it was. Day after day, for 40 years. But the manna wasn't just about physical sustenance. It was about reshaping a people who had been broken by centuries of slavery, a people who were learning what it meant to be truly free. Freedom, they discovered, wasn't just about escaping their physical chains. It was about learning to live in complete dependence on God. Throughout their journey, the desert served as a crucible, a place where the old ways of thinking and living were burned away. The Israelites, once slaves to the Egyptians, were being transformed into a people who relied solely on God. This was not an easy transformation. It took decades, and many struggled to let go of the mindset they had developed during their years in bondage. The desert stripped away their illusions of self-sufficiency. With no crops to harvest, no markets to visit, they were left with one choice: to trust in God or to fall into despair. Every time they bent down to gather manna, they were reminded of their dependence on him. Every morning, as the sun rose and the dew evaporated, taking the manna with it, they learned that God's provision was sufficient for the day, but that they had to seek it again tomorrow. The desert wasn't just a physical location, it was a spiritual experience. In Hebrew, the word for desert, midbar, is derived from the word davar, which means to speak. The desert was a place where God spoke to his people, away from the distractions of the world, where his voice could be heard in the silence. It was in this silence that the Israelites learned to listen, to trust, and to follow. They learned that God's guidance wasn't always about leading them to immediate comfort, but about preparing them for something greater, the promised land. But before they could reach that land, they had to be tested. Their faith had to be refined, their dependence on God solidified. The desert wasn't a place of abandonment, but a place of transformation. And manna, that simple, mysterious bread from heaven, was both a symbol of God's provision and a tool for shaping his people. Manna, a word that has captivated the minds of believers for centuries. When the Israelites first saw it, they had no idea what it was. In fact, the word manna itself is derived from their immediate reaction. As they looked down at the strange frost-like substance covering the ground, they asked, "What is it?" In Hebrew, this question translates to "man who," and thus the mysterious bread from heaven received its name. But what exactly was manna? Was it merely a type of food that miraculously appeared for the Israelites each morning, or was there something far deeper behind it? As we dig into the details of manna, we uncover not only its physical properties but also its profound spiritual symbolism. Manna was both a tangible miracle and a divine message. Let's start with what the Bible tells us about its appearance and characteristics. In the book of Exodus, manna is described as being small, round, and white, resembling frost or coriander seed. When the Israelites collected it, they could grind it into flour, bake it, and make cakes out of it. Its taste, according to the scriptures, was sweet, like wafers made with honey. Every morning, this mysterious food appeared with the dew, and as the sun grew hot, the manna would melt away. The Israelites had to gather it before it disappeared, just enough for each day's needs. But there was something even more extraordinary about manna. While it was a daily provision for the Israelites, it came with a divine instruction. They were not to store it for the next day. Any attempt to hoard the manna would result in it spoiling and becoming filled with worms. The only exception was on the day before the Sabbath, when they were allowed to gather a double portion that would remain fresh, providing for them during their day of rest. This aspect of manna was significant. It wasn't just about feeding the Israelites physically. It was about teaching them to trust in God's daily provision. Every day they had to rely on Him, gathering only what was necessary, and trusting that tomorrow He would provide again. It was a radical departure from the mentality of hoarding or securing one's future through material means. Manna became a lesson in faith and a demonstration of God's care. His people would be provided for, but they had to depend on Him one day at a time. However, manna wasn't just a physical substance with practical uses. It also carried deep spiritual meaning. The Israelites' entire experience in the wilderness was a process of transformation. In the same way that God used manna to sustain their bodies, He was also using it to shape their faith. In Deuteronomy, Moses reflects on this, stating, "He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord." Manna was not just food. It was a reminder that true sustenance comes from God, and that dependence on Him is the key to survival, both physically and spiritually. As the centuries have passed, the mystery of manna continues to intrigue people. Scholars, theologians, and even scientists have sought to understand what manna might have been. Could it have been a naturally occurring substance in the wilderness? Some have speculated that manna might have been a type of resin from desert plants, like the tamarisk tree, which produces a sweet, edible secretion under the right conditions. Others have proposed that it could have been the result of insect activity, where certain bugs feed on the tamarisk trees and leave behind sugary deposits that can be collected and eaten. These naturalistic explanations are fascinating and provide a possible link between the biblical account and the natural world. In fact, certain desert regions today still have similar substances that locals refer to as manna. However, even with these explanations, the true mystery of manna lies not in its physical properties, but in its divine timing and purpose. The fact that it appeared consistently, day after day, for 40 years, in exactly the right amount to feed an entire nation, points to something beyond natural processes. Whether manna was a supernatural creation or God's use of natural elements, its miraculous nature remains undeniable. And yet the story of manna doesn't end with the Israelites' journey through the desert. In the New Testament, Jesus makes a profound connection between Himself and the manna from heaven. In the Gospel of John, after miraculously feeding a crowd with just 5 loaves and 2 fish, Jesus speaks to the people, saying, "Your ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, and yet they died. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which anyone may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever." In this statement, Jesus reveals the true spiritual significance of manna. Just as the Israelites relied on manna for their daily survival, so too must believers rely on Christ for spiritual sustenance. Manna was a foreshadowing of the greater provision to come, the ultimate bread of life, which is Jesus Himself. Just as the Israelites gathered manna each day, Christians are called to seek Christ daily, to rely on Him for their spiritual needs, and to trust that He will sustain them through every trial. So, what is manna? Was it merely a type of desert food, or was it something more? The Bible's description, combined with modern theories, provides us with a fascinating picture. But ultimately, manna's greatest mystery lies in its purpose. It was a divine provision that pointed not only to God's care for his people's physical needs, but also to the deeper truth that life itself is sustained by God's word. In the wilderness of life, whether physical or spiritual, manna is a reminder that God's provision is constant, daily, and sufficient. Spiritual lessons from manna. Manna was more than just a miraculous provision of food. It was a tangible symbol of God's care, his guidance, and his desire to teach the Israelites vital spiritual lessons that would transform them into a people of faith. While the physical sustenance was critical to their survival, the spiritual lessons woven into the experience of gathering manna day after day had a much more profound and lasting impact. One of the most significant lessons manna taught was the importance of daily dependence on God. In the desert, the Israelites had nothing they could rely on but God himself. They had no crops to harvest, no animals to hunt, and no markets to buy food. Their survival was completely dependent on God's provision, which came in the form of manna each morning. But unlike other sources of food, manna could not be stored or hoarded. God gave strict instructions: gather only what you need for the day, and no more. Any attempt to save it for the next day would result in it spoiling. This daily dependence was a radical departure from the human instinct to accumulate and store resources for future security. By instructing the Israelites to gather only enough for each day, God was teaching them that his provision was sufficient, but that it must be sought continually. They had to trust him, not just for their long-term survival, but for their immediate needs each and every day. This is a powerful lesson that echoes through the ages, reminding us that we, too, must rely on God's grace daily. Just as the Israelites had to collect manna each morning, we are called to seek spiritual sustenance from God, trusting that he will provide for us not just in the future, but right now, in the present. Another profound spiritual lesson was the necessity of obedience. God's command regarding the collection of manna was clear: gather what you need for the day, and gather twice as much before the Sabbath, as no manna would fall on the seventh day. This instruction wasn't just about logistics, it was about learning to listen to and follow God's word. The Israelites had to learn that obedience to God's instructions was a key part of their relationship with him. Those who tried to disobey by gathering more manna than they needed found it spoiled and full of worms by the next day. Those who ignored the command to gather a double portion before the Sabbath found themselves without food on the day of rest. These experiences reinforced the idea that God's way was not just the best way, but the only way to survive. In the wilderness, manna became a daily test of their faith and willingness to obey. It wasn't just about whether they would receive food, it was about whether they would trust God enough to follow his commands, even when it didn't make immediate sense to them. This lesson is one that we can take to heart today. Sometimes God asks us to trust him in ways that don't align with our logic or instincts. But it is through obedience that we experience his provision and protection in our lives. Manna also taught the Israelites the value of gratitude. Each morning they woke up to find the ground covered with manna, a fresh gift from God to sustain them through the day. It was a daily reminder that they were cared for, even in the harshest conditions. But human nature often takes provision for granted. As time went on, some Israelites grew tired of manna and began to complain. We remember the fish we ate in Egypt at no cost, also the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic, they lamented, as recorded in Numbers 11:5. They longed for the variety and abundance of food they had enjoyed in Egypt, even though they had been slaves at the time. This attitude of ingratitude blinded them to the miracle that was happening in front of them every day. The manna they despised was a daily miracle, a sign of God's faithfulness, yet they failed to appreciate it. The lesson here is clear. We must cultivate hearts of gratitude, recognizing and thanking God for his provision, even when it doesn't look like what we expected or wanted. Gratitude transforms our perspective, allowing us to see the blessings in our lives rather than focusing on what we feel we are missing. Finally, manna represented the sufficiency of God's provision. The Israelites had to learn that what God provided was enough. There was no need to worry about tomorrow because God had already made provisions for it. The lesson of manna speaks to the human tendency to worry, to fear that what we have won't be enough to meet our needs. But just as God provided for the Israelites every day for 40 years, He promises to provide for us today. In Matthew 6 verse 25 to 34, Jesus reminds us not to worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Instead, we are to trust that our Heavenly Father knows our needs and will provide. This principle of sufficiency also applies to our spiritual lives. Just as God provided physical manna to sustain the Israelites, He provides spiritual manna to sustain us. Jesus in John 6:35 declares, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Just as the Israelites had to gather manna every morning, we too must seek Jesus daily. His provision is more than enough to meet all our needs, both physical and spiritual. The experience of manna in the wilderness was a profound spiritual journey for the Israelites. It taught them that true freedom comes from trusting in God, not just for survival, but for guidance, provision, and purpose. Manna was more than just food. It was a daily lesson in faith, trust, obedience, and gratitude. And it is a lesson that is still relevant today. In our own deserts, whether they be physical hardships, emotional struggles, or spiritual droughts, we are invited to trust in the God who provides. Just as He fed the Israelites in the wilderness, He promises to sustain us as well. Archaeological discoveries. For centuries, the story of manna has been wrapped in both spiritual significance and a sense of mystery. The Bible describes it as miraculous, falling from heaven to sustain the Israelites as they wandered the desert. But as with many biblical accounts, scholars, historians, and archaeologists have long sought to understand the physical reality behind this extraordinary event. Could manna have been something tangible, a natural substance that we can identify today? Or was it solely a supernatural act beyond the reach of scientific explanation? In recent decades, significant advancements in archaeology and botanical research have brought new insights into this age-old mystery. Some of the findings have been surprising, offering possible natural explanations for what the Israelites might have experienced as manna. Yet, even with these scientific theories, the miraculous nature of manna remains undeniable. One of the most compelling theories suggests that manna could have been a type of plant secretion from the tamarisk tree, a species that thrives in the Sinai desert where the Israelites wandered. Under certain conditions, the tamarisk tree produces a sticky, sweet resin that crystallizes into small white flakes. These flakes, which are high in carbohydrates and nutrients, could have been collected and eaten as food. The resin is known to appear in the early morning hours, much like the biblical description of manna arriving with the dew. This substance, referred to by some as manna of the desert, is still found in parts of the Middle East today. Bedouins have been known to gather it and use it as a sweetener. The fact that this natural phenomenon exists in the same region where the Israelites traveled lends credibility to the idea that manna could have had a natural origin. Additionally, the characteristics of this desert resin align closely with the biblical description. It appears in the morning, disappears with the heat of the sun, and can be processed into cakes or other food items. But while this theory is fascinating, it doesn't fully explain the miraculous aspect of manna. The Bible clearly states that manna fell every day, except on the Sabbath, for 40 years, providing enough sustenance for an entire nation. The tamarisk resin, while an interesting possibility, is limited in quantity and could not have sustained such a large population for such an extended period. Moreover, the timing and consistency of manna's appearance, as described in the Bible, points to something far beyond natural causes. Another theory suggests that manna may have been linked to insect activity. In the Sinai desert, there are insects, particularly scale bugs, that feed on the sap of tamarisk trees. As these insects digest the sap, they secrete a sugary substance that crystallizes on the tree branches. This sugary excretion, sometimes referred to as honeydew, can also resemble the small white flakes described in the Bible. Like the resin theory, this explanation aligns with the description of manna in terms of its appearance and the way it could be collected. Yet, just as with the tamarisk resin, this insect-related theory raises more questions than it answers. Could such a substance, produced by insects, really have provided enough food to sustain the Israelites for decades? The scale of the miracle described in Exodus far exceeds the quantities of honeydew that insects could produce. Furthermore, the idea that such a natural process would coincide perfectly with the Israelites' journey, appearing daily, ceasing on the Sabbath, and continuing for 40 years, defies ordinary scientific explanation. The latest archaeological findings continue to uncover new possibilities. Excavations in the Sinai region and surrounding areas have uncovered ancient campsites and settlements that correspond to the Israelites' period of wandering. These sites show evidence of sustained life in the desert, including tools and grinding stones that could have been used to process food like manna. In addition, recent studies have explored the unique environmental conditions of the Sinai desert, where extreme temperatures and the scarcity of food sources would have made a daily miracle of sustenance even more critical. What these discoveries reveal is a fascinating convergence between biblical accounts and scientific possibilities. Even if manna had a natural component, whether resin from trees or secretions from insects, the timing, consistency, and miraculous nature of its appearance point to divine intervention. The Israelites didn't just stumble upon a naturally occurring food source. They experienced a supernatural provision that met their needs in a precise and miraculous way. This intersection of the natural and the divine is where the true mystery of manna lies. Could God have used natural elements, like the tamarisk tree or insect secretions, to provide for his people? Absolutely. But the real miracle was not just in the substance itself, but in the way it was provided, daily, faithfully, and with perfect timing, in exactly the right amounts. The fact that the manna ceased once the Israelites entered the Promised Land further emphasizes its purpose as a temporary, miraculous provision for a specific time in their journey. These archaeological studies remind us that the Bible's stories are not just myth or legend. They are rooted in history, in real places and events that can be explored and studied. The search for manna is part of a broader quest to understand the physical realities behind the biblical narrative. But it also serves as a reminder that some mysteries are meant to inspire faith. The deeper we dig into the evidence, the more we see how the natural world can be a vessel for divine intervention. Whether or not the exact nature of manna is ever fully explained, its significance transcends the physical realm. Manna was, and still is, a symbol of God's provision. It teaches us that God is able to meet our needs, often in ways that we don't expect and cannot fully understand. For the Israelites, it was a daily reminder of his presence, a tangible expression of his care and guidance. Today, manna continues to intrigue both scientists and believers. Recent discoveries and theories add layers to our understanding, but they also highlight the profound truth that God's ways are not always meant to be fully understood. Manna may have been connected to natural phenomena, but its timing, abundance, and purpose elevate it to the realm of the miraculous. As we reflect on these findings, we are reminded that miracles often lie at the intersection of the natural and the divine. God works through creation, but he also works beyond it, transcending the ordinary to reveal his extraordinary power and care. Manna, whether understood through science or faith, remains a powerful symbol of God's provision for his people, then and now. As we've journeyed through the mystery of manna, we've seen how this simple yet miraculous bread from heaven sustained the Israelites through one of the most challenging periods of their history. But manna was much more than just food. It was a daily lesson in faith, trust, and dependence on God, a powerful symbol of his care and provision. Through manna, God demonstrated that he not only provides for our physical needs but also nourishes our spirits, teaching us to rely on him day by day. We've also explored how manna foreshadowed something far greater, the ultimate bread from heaven, Jesus Christ. Just as manna sustained the Israelites, Christ offers us spiritual sustenance that leads to eternal life. In him, we find the true meaning of what it means to live, not just by bread, but by every word that comes from God. The story of manna continues to resonate today. Whether we face physical, emotional, or spiritual challenges, the lessons God taught the Israelites in the wilderness still apply to us. We are reminded to trust Him daily, to cultivate gratitude for His blessings, and to rest in the knowledge that His provision is always enough. Just as He provided manna each morning, He continues to meet our needs in unexpected and miraculous ways. As we close, I invite you to reflect on your own journey. Where do you need to rely more on God's daily provision? What areas of your life require you to trust in His sufficiency? Remember, His care is constant, and His timing is perfect. If you found this message meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and share it with those who might need this reminder of God's faithfulness. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to our channel for more explorations of biblical stories and spiritual lessons. We're grateful for each one of you, especially our members, whose support makes it possible for us to continue sharing these messages. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May you walk in faith, trusting that God will provide just as He did for the Israelites so many years ago. Until next time, may you experience His grace and provision in every area of your life.